In the quiet suburbs of Orange County, California, a series of murders shocked the community and left law enforcement scrambling for answers. Between December 2011 and January 2012, 6 people were brutally killed by a man who seemed to have no clear pattern, yet whose actions suggested an intense personal mission. That man was Itzcoatl Ocampo, a 23-year-old former Marine whose life spiraled into a nightmare of paranoia, rage, and bloodshed. Born on March 28, 1988, in Mexico, Ocampo came to the United States as a child with his family, settling in Yorba Linda, California. He was quiet, intelligent, and athletic in his youth, and by high school he was well-liked and ran on the cross-country team. But after graduating, his life took a darker turn. Following the 9/11 attacks, Ocampo felt a deep patriotic urge to serve, and in 2006 he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was deployed to Iraq as a combat engineer, but unlike some veterans who found purpose in service, Ocampo returned home deeply scarred. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, recurring nightmares, and delusional thoughts. His friends noticed changes, paranoia, mood swings, and a growing resentment towards certain groups of people. Ocampo became convinced that some individuals were responsible for society's decline, and he began to fixate on the homeless population. On December 20, 2011, his delusions boiled over. In Placentia, California, Ocampo brutally stabbed 53-year-old Raul Flores, a homeless man who often slept near a shopping center. Less than a week later, on December 27, he struck again, killing 42-year-old James McGillivray in Fullerton. The attacks were frenzied and merciless. Ocampo stabbed his victims dozens of times, leaving investigators horrified at the sheer brutality. Authorities soon realized they were dealing with a serial killer, but Ocampo wasn't done. On January 12, 2012, he targeted 64-year-old John Barry and his friend, 53-year-old Vernon Ansira, both homeless men in Anaheim. Again, the assaults were savage, carried out in public spaces where the victims felt relatively safe. Witnesses described a young man fleeing the scenes, but Ocampo managed to stay one step ahead of police. Then, in a shocking twist, Ocampo deviated from his pattern. On January 13, 2012, he murdered Erskine Marshall Jr., another homeless man, and later that same day targeted a married couple, Elizabeth and Frank Cano, in Yorba Linda. This sudden expansion of his victim pool baffled investigators and suggested his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. His killing spree ended abruptly that night. After stabbing the Cano couple to death, Ocampo was spotted fleeing the scene. Police gave chase, and after a brief pursuit, he was arrested. In custody, Ocampo initially claimed he was ridding the streets of people who didn't deserve to be there. But as his mental health was evaluated, it became clear he was gripped by severe psychosis. Charged with 6 counts of murder, Ocampo faced the death penalty. However, his trial never came. On November 27, 2013, while awaiting trial in the Orange County Jail, he was found dead in his cell. Investigators determined he had committed suicide by ingesting a fatal mixture of cleaning chemicals. The Ocampo case remains one of the most disturbing in Orange County history, not just for the body count, but for the way it blurred the lines between calculated serial murder and the tragic unraveling of a deeply damaged mind. His story is a chilling reminder of how untreated mental illness, combined with trauma and isolation, can explode into catastrophic violence. Ocampo's killing spree sent waves of fear through the community. His first known murder occurred in December 2011, when he targeted a family friend, 53-year-old Raquel Estrada, and her 34-year-old son, Juan Herrera. They were found brutally stabbed in their Yorba Linda home, a crime so violent that investigators initially struggled to comprehend its motive. Authorities later linked Ocampo to the murders of homeless men in the area, marking a chilling escalation in his pattern. By late December, the body of James McGillivray, A 53-year-old homeless man was discovered behind a shopping center. He had been stabbed repeatedly, with the attack showing signs of extreme overkill. Days later, another homeless victim, 42-year-old Lloyd Middow, was found dead near the Santa Ana River Trail, stabbed more than 50 times. The brutality suggested not only rage, but a disturbing satisfaction in the act of killing. In January 2012, Ocampo struck again. He murdered 64-year-old John Barry, another homeless man, leaving his body near a Yorba Linda library. The community, already reeling, now lived in constant fear. Homeless advocacy groups began urging people living on the streets to avoid isolation and stay in well-lit areas. Ocampo's arrest came swiftly after his final attack on January 13, 2012. He murdered John Barry and 58-year-old Powell E. Kramer near a fast food restaurant in Anaheim. Witnesses saw the attack unfold and alerted police, who chased Ocampo on foot and captured him still covered in his victim's blood. Investigators were stunned by the lack of remorse he displayed during questioning. Prosecutors charged Ocampo with 6 counts of murder, seeking the death penalty. His defense argued that he suffered from severe mental illness, possibly linked to his father's military background and his own struggles adapting after leaving the Marines. However, the evidence of his premeditation was overwhelming. He had chosen vulnerable victims, carried out methodical attacks, and appeared to derive personal satisfaction from the killings. Before the trial could conclude, Ocampo was found dead in his jail cell in November 2013. Authorities ruled it a suicide. He had ingested a large amount of cleaning powder and choked to death. His sudden death left many unanswered questions about his true motives and mental state, but for the families of his victims, it was the end of a haunting chapter. Ocampo's story remains one of the most unsettling in California's criminal history, not because of a complex web of motives or elaborate schemes, but because of the raw, unrestrained violence he inflicted on people who had little means to defend themselves. His case serves as a grim reminder of how quickly a life can spiral into darkness, leaving devastation in its wake. On a warm September evening in 1990, the peaceful suburbs of Springfield, Virginia, were jolted by a crime so sudden and savage it would haunt the community for decades. In the darkness of that night, 2 promising young lives, Rachel Raver, a 22-year-old George Washington University student, and her friend Warren Fulton III were brutally cut short. Their bodies were found dumped in a secluded area near a soccer field, both shot at close range. What no one could have imagined at the time was that this was just the work of one man, a killer whose trail of violence spanned across states and years, hidden beneath a life of apparent normality. The man responsible was Alfredo Rolando Prieto, an El Salvadoran immigrant whose life story was forged in one of the most violent eras of Central America's history. Born in 1965, Prieto's early childhood was marked by the bloody Salvadoran Civil War. His formative years were spent surrounded by chaos, death, and political violence, experiences that would later be cited in court as a brutal backdrop to his psychological state. In 1981, seeking safety, his family fled to the United States and settled in California. But instead of a fresh start, America became the stage for a darker transformation. In California, Prieto slipped into the world of gangs and drugs. He joined a violent street gang, was expelled from high school, and began racking up criminal charges for armed robbery and assault. Even then, those who knew him could sense his simmering aggression, an unpredictable, almost cold detachment from human life. But despite his growing rap sheet, no one realized just how far his violent urges would go. The Virginia double murder in 1990 would later become one of the most important cases in linking Prieto to a larger web of killings. DNA collected at the scene was carefully preserved, though technology at the time couldn't connect it to any suspect. For years, the case went cold. Prieto, meanwhile, continued to move through life, committing other violent crimes, including rape and murder, leaving a trail of victims in multiple states. But it wasn't until more than a decade later, when advances in DNA analysis brought his profile to light, that the full extent of his crimes began to emerge. In 2005, while Prieto was already sitting on California's death row for another murder, a routine run of his DNA profile through the national database triggered a chilling match. His genetic fingerprint tied him directly to the 1990 murders of Raver and Fulton in Virginia. Investigators also began to suspect him in at least 6 other killings, stretching from California to the East Coast, all sharing elements of sudden, ruthless violence. Prieto's time in prison did nothing to soften his demeanor. Cold, arrogant, and often smirking in court, he seemed unfazed by the mounting evidence against him. In 2008, he was extradited to Virginia to stand trial for the Springfield double murder. Prosecutors painted him as a predator who hunted for victims without remorse, targeting young people in random acts of lethal cruelty. The jury agreed, convicting him and sentencing him to death, not once, but twice, for each life he took that night. But Prieto's case dragged on for years due to legal appeals and challenges, including arguments about his mental capacity and whether he was intellectually disabled. Defense attorneys claimed his troubled upbringing and exposure to extreme violence in El Salvador had left lasting psychological scars. The prosecution countered with the brutal facts: multiple murders, multiple rapes, and a consistent pattern of predatory behavior. Finally, on October 1, 2015, after 25 years and countless court battles, Alfredo Prieto was executed by lethal injection in Virginia. Even in his final moments, he showed no remorse, offering no apology to the families of his victims. For investigators and survivors, his death brought a measure of closure, but also the chilling realization that the true number of his victims might never be fully known. Alfredo Prieto's life story remains a grim testament to how violence can travel across borders, hide in plain sight, and resurface years later through the unrelenting work of forensic science. He was not a headline-grabbing serial killer with a notorious name, but in the shadows, his brutality rivaled some of the most infamous murderers in American history. In the quiet farming villages of Hunan Province, China, life often followed a predictable rhythm: planting, harvesting, raising families, and caring for elders. It was a world far removed from the chaos of the big cities. But beneath that serene landscape, a predator walked among them. His name was Huang Yong, and his crimes would shatter the trust and innocence of his rural community, leaving a trail of grief and unanswered questions. Huang Yong was born in 1974 in Henan to a poor farming family. His childhood was unremarkable to most, but inside, something far darker was growing. Friends and neighbors would later recall that he had always been an odd child, quiet, solitary, and sometimes disturbingly fascinated by military life. He dreamed of being a soldier, idolizing war heroes, and seeing himself as a man destined for power and control. At just 16, he left his village and joined the army, a move that seemed to give him structure but also sharpened his darker impulses. Military life taught him discipline, but it also exposed him to violence, control tactics, and a sense of authority over others. After his discharge, Huang returned to civilian life, but he never really fit in. He drifted between jobs and relationships, struggling to find a place in a society that no longer followed the rigid order of the army. His loneliness and frustration festered, and somewhere along the way, his obsession with killing began to take shape. By the late 1990s, Huang Yong had developed a sinister plan. His chosen victims were not women, as is often the case with serial killers, but young teenage boys, usually from poor rural families, boys no one would notice missing right away. He lured them with promises of work, education, or gifts. Sometimes he claimed he could help them join the military, playing on their hopes the same way he once had dreams of escape from poverty. Once he gained their trust, he would take them to his home. There, the trap was sprung. Huang had a ritual. He would ply his victims with food and drink, sometimes letting them play with his military gear, making them feel comfortable. Then, suddenly, he would strike. Strangulation was his method of choice, and he seemed to take a calculated, cold pleasure in the act. Some reports suggest that he bound and photographed his victims, treating their deaths like trophies in his own twisted game. For years, boys vanished from the surrounding villages, and no one connected the disappearances. Rural life in Henan meant that some children left home to find work and never returned, while others moved to the cities. Police investigations were minimal, and Huang Yong's calculated choice of victims kept him below the radar. The disappearances were written off as runaway cases, until one survivor changed everything. In November 2003, a teenage boy named Zhang Liang managed to escape from Huang Yong's home. Huang had lured Zhang in the same way as his other victims, but something went wrong. Perhaps Huang underestimated the boy's will to survive. Bound and in mortal danger, Zhang waited for his captor to leave the room, then worked himself free and fled into the night. Zhang went straight to the police, telling them in chilling detail what had happened. At first, the authorities were skeptical. In rural Henan, such accusations against a local man seemed almost unthinkable. But Zhang's testimony was too precise to ignore, and when police arrived at Huang Yong's house, they found damning evidence: ropes, photographs, and personal belongings of missing boys. Confronted with the evidence, Huang began to confess, but in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. He admitted to killing at least 17 boys, though some believe the true number was higher. He described his murders not with remorse, but almost with pride, as if they were part of a personal mission. In his mind, he claimed, he was helping his victims by keeping them from growing up to become bad people. His twisted logic suggested he saw himself as a moral enforcer, though his actions were anything but moral. Huang explained how he carefully chose victims who were easy to manipulate, those from broken families, those desperate for opportunity, those who could disappear without creating an uproar. He would kill them quickly, sometimes within hours of meeting them, other times after days of manipulation. His precision, patience, and ability to mask his true intentions made him one of China's most dangerous modern serial killers. The trial was swift. Public outrage swept through the region as the details emerged. Parents who had once assumed their children had run away now learned the truth, that their sons had crossed paths with a man who saw their lives as disposable. In December 2003, just weeks after his arrest, Huang Yong was found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to death. On December 26, 2003, he was executed by shooting. Even after his death, Huang Yong's case left deep scars. For many families, there was no closure, only the knowledge that their children had suffered at the hands of a man who had blended in so easily with ordinary rural life. His story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can grow quietly, unnoticed, even in the most peaceful places, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who hide behind trust and familiarity. In the quiet Bavarian town of Sonnthofen, Germany, a chilling figure lurked within the walls of a local hospital. Patients came seeking care and comfort, but for many, their final moments were marked not by healing, but by the cold hands of death delivered by a man they trusted. His name was Stephan Letter, a seemingly devoted male nurse who would go on to be remembered as Germany's most prolific post-war serial killer. Born in 1978, Letter grew up in a seemingly ordinary home, with no obvious signs of the darkness that would later define his life. He entered the nursing profession with a strong sense of dedication, earning the trust of both his colleagues and the vulnerable people in his care. But beneath this facade lay a disturbing detachment from human life, and an obsession with control over the fragile line between life and death. Letter. By the early 2000s, Letter was employed in a military hospital in Santa Fe, caring for elderly and terminally ill patients. Many were at the end of their lives, or so everyone thought. In reality, the sudden spike in deaths on his shifts began to stir suspicion. Patients who had been stable would inexplicably pass away during the night. The cause of death was often vague, attributed to natural causes, and the pattern remained unnoticed for far too long. Letter's method was both chillingly efficient and disturbingly intimate. He administered lethal doses of medication, often muscle relaxants and sedatives, that would silently stop the heart or shut down breathing. Some victims were in pain, others merely inconvenient in his schedule. To Letter, deciding who should live or die became a perverse extension of his professional role, a godlike power that he wielded without remorse. What made his crimes even more disturbing was that he sometimes justified them as acts of mercy. In his mind, he was relieving suffering, sparing patients from drawn-out pain. But many victims were not terminal at all. Some were improving, others had been expected to live for months or even years. His actions were less about compassion and more about control, and perhaps the thrill of ending a life with nothing more than a syringe. For months, the deaths continued without intervention. Families mourned quietly, believing their loved ones had simply succumbed to illness. Colleagues, though unsettled by the frequency of deaths during his shifts, could not bring themselves to suspect the quiet, efficient nurse they had worked alongside. It wasn't until a fellow staff member finally voiced concerns, and an internal investigation began, that the true horror started to emerge. Exhumations were ordered, and toxicology tests revealed lethal drug levels in multiple bodies. The scale of the killing spree was unlike anything German investigators had seen in decades. In 2004, Stephan Letter was arrested, and what followed shocked the entire nation. Police linked him to the deaths of at least 29 patients, though the true number was feared to be far higher. Some investigators believed the toll could have reached over 80 victims, but many potential cases were impossible to prove due to the rapid decomposition of remains and incomplete medical records. During interrogations, Letter appeared disturbingly calm. He admitted to many of the killings, describing in detail how he prepared the injections and the moments he watched his victims slip away. To him, it was quick, clinical, almost routine. But when pressed, his reasoning shifted. Sometimes he spoke of mercy, other times of being overwhelmed with work, and occasionally he admitted that he simply wanted the ward to be quieter. The trial in 2006 drew massive public attention. Survivors' families packed the courtroom, listening in disbelief as prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who had turned his medical training into a weapon. Experts testified that his so-called mercy killings were nothing more than murder, often robbing patients of years they could have lived. The court found Stephan Letter guilty of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, sentencing him to life in prison. Under German law, life generally allows for parole after 15 years, but the severity and premeditation of his crimes ensured that he would likely never be released. The aftermath left a deep scar on Germany's healthcare system. Questions about patient safety, monitoring of medical staff, and the ease with which someone in his position could act unchecked haunted the public discourse for years. Hospitals introduced stricter oversight and drug controls, but for many, the reforms came too late. Letter's legacy remains one of betrayal, the ultimate violation of trust between a caregiver and those in their most vulnerable moments. Behind the professional uniform and calm demeanor was a man who quietly decided the fates of dozens, perhaps more, and who transformed a place of healing into his own silent killing ground. To this day, Stephan Letter stands as a reminder that the most dangerous predators often hide in plain sight, cloaked not in menace, but in the comforting guise of those sworn to protect us. In the chaotic heart of Mexico City, A man lived behind closed doors whose life was a grotesque fusion of horror and obsession. His name was José Luís Calva Zepeda, a writer, a poet, and hidden beneath layers of charm and eccentricity, a predator whose darkest cravings would shock an entire nation. Born in 1969, Calva's childhood was marked by abandonment and loss. His father died when he was just a boy, and his mother left him soon after, leaving the young José to navigate life alone. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed an unusual gift for writing, often penning poems and short stories. But behind his words, there was an unsettling undercurrent, one that hinted at his fascination with death, flesh, and control. As he grew older, Calva became something of a drifter, never holding a stable job, relying on his charisma and manipulative charm to survive. He would often quote literature, seducing women with his intellect. But those who entered his life rarely suspected the true nature of the man they were letting in. In 2007, police were called to his apartment after a woman he had been seeing was reported missing. What they found inside seemed ripped from a nightmare. In the dim, cluttered living space, investigators discovered pieces of cooked meat stored in the refrigerator, meat that was later confirmed to be human. On a plate, half-eaten, were remains that still bore traces of seasoning. In the closet, a human leg was wrapped in plastic. Elsewhere, bones and flesh were hidden in cereal boxes, among books, and inside cooking pots. The missing woman, Alejandra Galeana, was found dismembered. Her body parts were scattered, some stored, some cooked. Calva later claimed he had been preparing the flesh for research, for a novel he was writing about cannibalism, insisting he had not killed her, only used her body after death. But investigators quickly realized this was no morbid artistic experiment. It was the work of a killer who took pleasure in consuming his victims in the most literal way. When confronted, Calva attempted to escape, leaping from his apartment balcony in a desperate bid for freedom. He fell 2 stories, injuring himself, and was immediately arrested. His calm demeanor after the arrest was chilling. Even as the evidence mounted, he maintained an almost theatrical air, speaking about his writing and art as though nothing had happened. Once in custody, the full extent of José Luís Calva Zepeda's depravity began to emerge. Police searching his apartment found manuscripts for unfinished novels, filled with disturbing passages about cannibalism, domination, and the transformation of human flesh into a form of intimacy. His fascination with horror was not merely academic, it was lived experience. Forensic analysis confirmed that the meat found in his home matched the DNA of Alejandra Galeana. But this was not the first time Calva had been linked to a woman's mysterious disappearance. 2 of his previous partners had vanished under suspicious circumstances. One of them, Veronica Consuelo, had been found dead years earlier, her body showing signs of mutilation. Another, identified only as his former girlfriend, had gone missing without a trace. Though prosecutors could not conclusively link him to all the cases, the pattern was undeniable. Calva's trial became a media sensation. The press labeled him the cannibal poet, and every detail of his life was dissected for the public. His calm, almost smug attitude in court only fueled the horror. He claimed he was misunderstood, that his writing was a misunderstood form of art, and that the human flesh in his possession was accidentally acquired. Despite his claims, the court saw through his performance. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to prison, where his macabre reputation followed him. Fellow inmates feared and despised him, and he became an isolated figure even behind bars. On December 11, 2007, before he could face a full trial on all charges, Calva was found dead in his cell. The official report ruled it a suicide by hanging, using a belt tied to his prison bars. But even in death, whispers persisted. Some believed other inmates had helped speed his end. José Luís Calva Zepeda's story remains one of the most chilling in Mexico's criminal history, not only because of his crimes, but because of the way he cloaked his monstrosity in the language of art and intellect. Behind his words, behind the poetry, there was only hunger. A hunger that no book, no lover, and no amount of flesh could ever satisfy. In the serene forests of the American Southeast, where hikers wander for peace and solitude, few could imagine the lurking presence of a man who turned those same trails into his personal hunting ground. Gary Michael Hilton, later dubbed the National Forest serial killer, was no stranger to the wilderness. It was where he felt most at home, where he could vanish without a trace, and where, for years, bodies would disappear into the shadows of the trees. Born in 1946, Hilton's early life was marked by instability and hints of darkness. He served in the U.S. Army during the 1960s, but was discharged after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. While others sought treatment and stability, Hilton drifted through life, moving from place to place, living out of his van, and surviving on odd jobs. But beneath the surface of this drifter's lifestyle, a much darker nature was slowly taking shape. Hilton learned to adapt to the wild, becoming intimately familiar with its trails, campsites, and the habits of those who ventured deep into the woods. He was charming enough to gain a hiker's trust, yet calculated enough to know when to strike. His weapon was not always force at first. It was patience, manipulation, and the art of choosing victims who were isolated, vulnerable, and far from help. The first murder linked to Hilton occurred in October 2007, when 46-year-old Cheryl Dunlap vanished while hiking in the Apalachicola National Forest in Florida. She was an experienced hiker and nature lover, but on December 15th, her decapitated body was found. The brutality was staggering. Her hands were also missing. Surveillance footage later showed Hilton using her ATM card, wearing a mask to hide his identity. Investigators had a suspect, but no name yet. They knew only that a dangerous predator was stalking national parks and forests. And his willingness to kill without mercy meant it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Just weeks later, on New Year's Day 2008, Meredith Emerson, a 24-year-old hiker, set out along the Blood Mountain Trail in Georgia. She was young, strong, and independent, the kind of victim Hilton might have avoided under different circumstances. But Hilton saw an opportunity. Witnesses later recalled seeing him walking near her that day. When Meredith failed to return home, search efforts began immediately. For days, her faithful dog was found wandering alone, but there was no sign of her. When police finally caught up with Hilton, he agreed to lead them to Meredith's body in exchange for avoiding the death penalty in Georgia. His confession was as cold as the winter air in which her remains were found. He admitted to holding her captive for days, trying to force her to give up her ATM PIN, and then killing her to avoid being caught. But Meredith and Cheryl were not Hilton's only victims. Authorities began piecing together a chilling trail of murders, stretching across multiple states, each tied to this drifter who blended into the very landscapes that became his killing fields. With Hilton now in custody, investigators dug deeper, and what they uncovered was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned detectives. In North Carolina, the remains of elderly hikers John and Irene Bryant, a married couple, were found months after they disappeared in October 2007. Evidence revealed the same pattern: a remote forest location, robbery through ATM withdrawals, and a violent end. Irene had been bludgeoned to death. John had been shot in the head. The killings were not acts of sudden rage. They were methodical. Hilton targeted national forests because they offered cover, no security cameras, no immediate witnesses, and countless miles of terrain that could swallow the evidence. He stalked his victims, attacked when they were alone, and quickly moved to secure their bank information to fund his drifting existence. Prosecutors described Hilton as a cold-blooded predator who saw hikers not as people, but as prey. His knowledge of survival skills allowed him to disappear into the wilderness for days, or even weeks at a time. He carried minimal supplies, often sleeping in his van or under makeshift camps, and he knew how to evade police in remote areas. By 2011, Hilton had been convicted in multiple states: life in prison in Georgia for Meredith Emerson, death in Florida for Cheryl Dunlap, and life sentences in federal and North Carolina courts for the Bryant's murders. Each trial revealed more about his twisted psychology, a man who thrived on control, intimidation, and the fear his victims must have felt in their final hours. Even in prison, Hilton showed no remorse. He admitted his crimes with an unsettling calm, as if recounting a hunting trip rather than brutal murders. Law enforcement officials believe there may be more victims whose disappearances remain unsolved, lost forever in the dense forests that Hilton once roamed. Gary Michael Hilton's story is a reminder of a terrifying truth. Sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't hidden deep in the wilderness. They walk right alongside you on the trail, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And in the silent, shadowed expanse of America's national forests, Hilton found the perfect hunting ground. In the sweltering heat of Mexico City in August 1942, the quiet suburb of Tacuba seemed far removed from the chaos of the Second World War. The neighborhood's narrow streets and low-slung houses were home to hard-working families, children playing in the dust, and neighbors who knew each other's names. But inside one small, modest home on Mar del Norte Street, a darkness was growing, hidden behind the polite smile of a 28-year-old man named Gregorio Cárdenas Hernández. Gregorio was no ordinary man. To the outside world, he was a law student with a calm demeanor and an almost shy personality. He kept to himself, studied diligently, and showed a deep interest in science and psychology. But beneath this facade simmered a fascination with death, sexuality, and control, a dangerous mix that had been festering since his troubled youth. By late August, Gregorio's obsession could no longer be contained. He began inviting young women into his home, women who thought they were simply visiting a quiet, polite man. The first was Maria de Los Angeles Gonzalez, a 16-year-old student. On August 15, 1942, she stepped into his house, completely unaware she would never walk out alive. Gregorio's method was chillingly calculated. He lured Maria with kindness, offering conversation and drinks. At some point during the evening, his demeanor shifted. The man who had moments ago been gentle and attentive suddenly became cold and mechanical. He attacked her, strangling the life from her body with a quiet precision, as if performing a ritual. When the deed was done, he did something even more disturbing. He buried her in his own garden. But Gregorio was not finished. Within days, he repeated the process, killing 3 more young women. Rosa Reyes, a 13-year-old, Raquel Martinez, 16, and a sex worker named Graciela Arias Avalos. Each murder followed a similar pattern: seduction, sudden violence, and burial among the flowers and soil of his garden. The fact that their bodies were decomposing just outside his bedroom window did not seem to bother him. For Gregorio, the murders were not merely acts of violence. They were a way to satisfy a twisted need for domination and control. Neighbors began to notice an unpleasant smell drifting from his property. But in those days, no one imagined something as horrific as multiple bodies buried in a residential garden. Gregorio continued with his life, seemingly undisturbed, even hosting visitors who sat in his home while the dead lay just meters away. It wasn't until he personally confessed, writing to the police to detail his crimes, that the nightmare became known. His confession was not an act of guilt. When the police arrived at Gregorio's home in September 1942, they were met with a scene straight from a macabre dream. The young law student led them to his backyard, pointing out the shallow graves as if showing off a garden project. The officers began digging, and the stench of death filled the air. One by one, the bodies emerged, partially decomposed, bound, and lifeless. The horror of it shook even the most experienced investigators. Gregorio was arrested on the spot, but instead of panic, he seemed almost pleased. His calm, almost smug demeanor unsettled the officers. In his detailed confession, he explained how he killed each victim, describing their final moments without hesitation, almost as if he were recounting a mundane event. It was clear that the murders were not impulsive acts. They had been meticulously planned. The case shocked Mexico. Newspapers ran lurid headlines about the Strangler of Tacuba, and crowds gathered outside the jail just to catch a glimpse of him. People wanted to know how an educated man, from a respectable background, could commit such crimes. Psychologists who examined him found a man with narcissistic tendencies, an obsession with sex and death, and a lack of empathy that bordered on the inhuman. At trial, Gregorio's behavior was as unsettling as his crimes. He spoke clearly without remorse and sometimes even smiled. The court sentenced him to life in prison, but prison life did not break him. Instead, it gave him a new platform. While incarcerated, Gregorio studied law and became something of a prison celebrity, even representing other inmates in legal matters. In a twist that baffled the public, Gregorio was eventually pardoned in 1976 after serving 34 years. By then, he was seen by some not as a monster, but as a rehabilitated man. He even made public appearances, proudly telling his story to journalists as though his horrific past was just an unusual chapter in an otherwise respectable life. But the truth could not be erased. No matter how educated or articulate Gregorio appeared in his later years, the garden in Tacuba would always remain the silent witness to the young lives he had stolen. Victims who had walked into his home, trusting the quiet, polite man who would become one of Mexico's most infamous killers. Gregorio Cárdenas remains a chilling example of how evil can hide in plain sight, behind a smile, a soft voice, and the mask of respectability. The horror he planted in that garden would never truly be buried. In the shadows of Scandinavia's quiet forests and icy lakes, a man emerged who would come to be known as the country's most infamous serial killer. Or so the world believed. His name was Thomas Quick, but that wasn't the name he was born with. In 1950, he entered the world as Sture Bergwall in Sweden, into a devout but troubled family. His childhood was far from idyllic. He would later claim that he endured abuse, humiliation, and deep psychological scars that shaped the darkness growing inside him. For decades, Bergwall drifted through life, struggling with his identity, his sexuality, and an escalating dependence on drugs. He was no stranger to the law, with a criminal history that included sexual offenses and robberies. But it was in the early 1990s, while confined to Säter Mental Hospital after a violent assault, that his name, under the self-chosen alias Thomas Quick, began to haunt Scandinavia. From inside the hospital, Quick began to confess to murders. Not just one or two, but dozens, spanning decades and crossing borders, from Sweden to Norway, Denmark, and even Finland. He claimed to have abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered young boys and girls, men and women, in a spree of unimaginable cruelty. He spoke of victims whose bodies had never been found, describing chilling details. The smell of the forest soil as he buried them, the sound of their final breaths, and the twisted thrill he felt when taking their lives. Police, desperate for answers in numerous cold cases, began to listen. Soon, investigations were reopened. Families who had long mourned without closure saw the possibility of justice, and Thomas Quick became a household name. Court after court heard his confessions, and over time, he was convicted of 8 murders, including the killing of 9-year-old Johan Asplund, whose disappearance had haunted Sweden for decades. The media painted him as a monster beyond redemption, the Swedish Hannibal Lecter. But there was something unusual, something almost too neat about his admissions. His stories shifted over time. His memory seemed foggy, and his confessions often matched details that were already public knowledge. Still, prosecutors and psychiatrists stood by him, convinced they had finally unmasked a prolific killer hiding in plain sight. For years, Thomas Quick remained behind the secure walls of the psychiatric facility, speaking openly about his murders in therapy sessions and interviews, feeding the public's morbid fascination. He described cannibalism, sexual sadism, and the macabre trophies he claimed to have taken from his victims. In the eyes of the world, he was a predator who had roamed free for too long, and now, at last, he was caged. But behind the scenes, cracks in the case began to form. Investigative journalists, defense lawyers, and a few skeptical officials started questioning the evidence, or lack thereof. There were no bodies recovered from his supposed burial sites. No DNA linked him to the crimes. No physical evidence at all. Every conviction had been based solely on his own confessions. And when those confessions were examined closely, disturbing patterns emerged. Details he gave often didn't match forensic findings. Timelines didn't add up, and his descriptions of certain crime scenes were wildly inaccurate. The deeper they dug, the more it appeared that Thomas Quick might not be a killer at all, but a deeply disturbed man who had invented his crimes. Under heavy psychiatric medication, and in an environment where police and therapists seemed eager to believe him, Bergvall may have fabricated his murders, feeding off the attention, the notoriety, and perhaps the strange validation it brought him. By 2008, the truth began to unravel publicly. One by one, the cases against him were re-examined, and shockingly, every single one of Quick's murder convictions was overturned. The man once believed to be Scandinavia's deadliest serial killer walked free in 2013, after spending more than 2 decades locked away for crimes that could not be proven and may never have happened. Yet the legacy of Thomas Quick endures, not just as a bizarre legal scandal, but as a chilling reminder of how the justice system can be led astray by confessions, by the hunger for resolution, and by the darkness of human psychology. Whether he was a cunning manipulator or a tragic figure lost in his own delusions, one fact remains. Thomas Quick left an indelible scar on Sweden's history, a name forever linked with murder, even if the truth about those murders will remain buried forever in the shadows. In the shadowy corners of China's rural provinces, a figure moved unseen, his presence heralding only death and despair. His name was Xinhai, a man who would become one of the most prolific and merciless serial killers in the nation's history. Known later as the Monster Killer, Yong's crimes would send shockwaves through an entire country and leave investigators haunted by the brutality of his acts. Yong was born on July 29, 1968, in Zhengyang County, Henan Province. The 4th child in a poor farming family, his early life was one of hardship and isolation. Those who knew him as a child remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, and often detached from others. At school he was intelligent but distant, never forming close friendships. In his teenage years, Yong began to show signs of rebellion, dropping out of school at age 17, leaving his rural home in search of something more, though what he found was the darkness within himself. He drifted from city to city, taking up odd jobs in construction and factory work. But along the way, he began to accumulate a criminal record. In 1988, Yong was sentenced to prison for theft. Released in 1991, he soon found himself back behind bars in 1993 for attempted rape, serving 5 more years. It was in prison, surrounded by violence and hardened criminals, that Yong's already cold and detached personality seemed to harden into something far more dangerous. When he was released in 1997, Yong severed all contact with his family. He cut himself off from any human connection, living like a drifter and moving constantly from province to province. But this constant wandering was not aimless, it was hunting. His targets were not chosen for revenge, money, or even lust. Instead, he attacked at random, descending upon entire families in their homes, killing everyone inside with terrifying efficiency. Yong's killing spree began in earnest in 1999, and over the next 4 years, his name would become synonymous with pure terror. He would break into houses late at night, armed with blunt instruments like hammers or axes. There would be no warning, no negotiation, no mercy. Men, women, children, all were slaughtered in their beds. His attacks were swift but frenzied, leaving behind scenes so gruesome that even experienced police officers struggled to comprehend the cruelty. In some instances, entire families of 5 or 6 were wiped out in a single night. Survivors were rare. Those few who did live through his assaults often carried lifelong physical injuries and psychological scars. Authorities were baffled. The attacks were spread across multiple provinces, from Henan to Hebei to Anhui, making it difficult to connect the crimes. He left no witnesses when he could help it, and his itinerant lifestyle made him a ghost in the system. The randomness of his murders sent waves of panic through rural communities. People began sleeping in shifts, barricading their doors, or even fleeing their homes entirely. Yet Yang remained elusive. He dressed in shabby clothing, blended into crowds, and boarded trains or buses immediately after each killing, vanishing before police could respond. By late 2003, police suspected they were dealing with a single perpetrator, but they had no name. That changed on November 3, 2003, when Yang was stopped during a routine check in Kangzhou, Hebei province. At first, the officers thought it was just another transient man without proper identification. But fingerprints revealed a far darker truth. They matched those found at multiple murder scenes. The monster killer had finally been caught. Once in custody, young Xinhai wasted little time in confessing to his crimes. In cold, emotionless detail, he described a 4-year campaign of slaughter that spanned 4 provinces. He admitted to killing 67 people and injuring 23 others in 26 separate attacks between 1999 and 2003. His victims ranged from small children to the elderly, and the brutality of his methods stunned even the most hardened investigators. Yang explained that his killings were random by design. He did not seek revenge, nor did he rob his victims. He targeted homes simply because they were there, because they were vulnerable, and because killing gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. "When I killed people, I had a desire to kill more," he told police with chilling detachment. It didn't matter who they were. In many cases, Yang would choose isolated farmhouses at the edge of villages. He would strike at night, smashing doors or windows to gain entry. Armed with whatever weapon he carried, often a hammer, shovel, or axe, he would move from room to room, striking each sleeping victim repeatedly until there was no movement. He showed no signs of hesitation or pity, and he left as quickly as he came, walking back into the darkness to board the next train out of town. Psychologists who studied Yang after his arrest noted his complete lack of empathy and his flat emotional responses. He did not appear to suffer from delusions or hallucinations. His violence was not the result of insanity in the legal sense. Instead, he seemed to embody a cold-blooded, predatory instinct, killing simply because he wanted to. His ability to murder indiscriminately, without motive or remorse, set him apart even from other serial killers. Yang's trial began in early 2004 and lasted just one day. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own confessions sealed his fate. On February 1, 2004, the court sentenced him to death. He showed no visible reaction to the verdict. Just 13 days later, on February 14, 2004, Valentine's Day, Yang Xinhai was executed by shooting. In the aftermath of his crimes, rural communities in China remained shaken for years. Parents kept children indoors at night, neighbors checked in on one another, and the legend of the monster killer became a grim cautionary tale. The sheer scale and randomness of Yang's murders have made him one of the most feared and studied serial killers in modern Chinese history. Yang Xinhai's name is now forever tied to a chilling truth, that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we imagine in folklore, but the ones who walk among us unseen until the night they choose to strike. On the quiet streets of Wichita, Kansas, a predator lurked in plain sight. He was not the shadowy figure most people imagine when they think of a serial killer. He was a neighbor, a husband, a father, a church leader. By day, Dennis Lynn Rader appeared to be the kind of man you could trust without hesitation. But behind his polite smile and unassuming demeanor hid a darkness so profound it would take decades to uncover. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in the nearby town of Wichita. From an early age, his mind was twisted by violent fantasies. While other children played innocently, Rader found pleasure in thoughts of domination, control, and suffering. He admitted later that as a boy he developed an obsession with tying knots and binding animals, practicing the acts that would one day become his gruesome signature. He grew into a seemingly ordinary man. After high school, he attended Kansas Wesleyan University, later enlisting in the U.S. Air Force. His military service was uneventful, but it provided him with discipline and patience, skills he would later use in his predatory rituals. Upon returning home, he married Paula Dietz in 1971, and together they had 2 children. He found steady employment first in an outdoor supply company and later as a compliance officer for the city, ironically, a position of authority that allowed him to exercise control over others. But the ordinary life was an illusion. Beneath it, Rader was carefully crafting a persona that would terrorize Wichita for decades. In January 1974, his fantasies exploded into reality. His first known victims were the Otero family, Joseph and Julie, along with their children Joseph Jr. and Josephine. On the morning of January 15th, Rader broke into their home, armed with a plan he had been rehearsing for weeks. Calmly and methodically, he bound each family member with ropes, savoring the control. He strangled them one by one, taking time to watch the life drain from their eyes. The Otero murders shocked the community, but the killer had only begun his reign of terror. Over the next several years, Rader would kill again and again. He stalked his victims meticulously, often watching them for weeks before striking. His attacks followed a disturbing ritual: bind, torture, kill. 3 words that would become his infamous moniker: BTK. By 1977, Wichita was gripped by fear. That year, he murdered Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother, after breaking into her home while her children were present. He tied her up and strangled her, leaving her children locked in a bathroom. Just months later, he claimed another victim, Nancy Fox, whom he stalked and killed in her own home. BTK craved recognition. In 1978, frustrated by the lack of media coverage, he sent a chilling letter to a local TV station. In it, he detailed his murders, mocked police efforts, and suggested names for himself, including the now infamous BTK. The letter revealed his need to be seen, to be feared, and to ensure the city knew there was a predator among them. Years passed, but BTK never truly went away. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old neighbor. He took her body to a church, where he was a respected member, posing her for photographs, before dumping her in a ditch. The horror lay not just in the killings, but in his ability to blend back into society, greeting neighbors with a smile while carrying the memory of their slaughtered friends. By 1991, his known murders totaled 10. Then, as suddenly as he had emerged, BTK seemed to vanish. For more than a decade, there were no new victims. The people of Wichita began to breathe again. But the monster was not gone, only waiting. In the years following the Otero murders, Wichita lived under a quiet cloud of fear. Residents locked their doors, kept lights on through the night, and looked suspiciously at strangers. But Dennis Rader, the man responsible for this terror, lived comfortably among them, his image as a devoted husband, father, and churchgoer masking the truth. He worked ordinary jobs, attended community events, and served as president of his local church council. He was even employed as a compliance officer, enforcing city codes on his neighbors. The irony was as sharp as a knife. Behind the stern civic worker was a man who had bound, tortured, and killed without mercy. By 1977, Rader's compulsion returned with terrifying force. He strangled Shirley Vian, a mother of 3, leaving her children locked in a bathroom while he carried out his ritual. Later that same year, he took the life of 25-year-old Nancy Fox, breaking into her home, binding her, and killing her in a manner he had perfected over years of fantasy and practice. What set Rader apart from many killers was his hunger for recognition. He didn't simply want to kill, he wanted to be feared, to be remembered. He began sending taunting letters to the police and the press, describing his crimes in chilling detail, and signing them with the name he gave himself: BTK. Bind, torture, kill. These communications reignited public panic and cemented his status as an urban legend in Wichita. For decades, Rader lived in plain sight. His murders became less frequent, but the urge never left him. He struck again in 1985, murdering Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street. He killed her in her home, then transported her body to his church, where he posed her and took photographs before dumping her in a ditch. In 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerly, and in 1991, Dolores Davis. Each killing followed his ritualistic pattern: binding, torture, and death, often with a disturbing sexual component. When the killings stopped, the city slowly began to believe BTK was gone forever. But Rader was simply dormant, content with his memories and trophies. That is, until 2004, when a local newspaper ran a story on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The attention reignited his desire for the spotlight. BTK returned. Letters began arriving at news stations and police offices, packages containing photographs, crime scene items, and cryptic messages. Rader asked police in one letter whether a floppy disk could be traced back to him. The police replied publicly in a newspaper ad, assuring him it was safe. In an act of arrogance and misplaced trust, Rader sent one. That floppy disk contained metadata linking it to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, where Rader was council president. Investigators quickly confirmed the connection through DNA analysis taken from his daughter's medical records. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. During questioning, he spoke of his crimes with chilling detachment, describing them as projects and himself as a monster who couldn't control his urges. His confession was methodical, almost proud. In August 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Behind prison walls, Rader remains a living reminder of evil hidden in plain sight. A friendly neighbor, a trusted church leader, and a doting father, who by night became BTK, the embodiment of terror. His story stands as a warning. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones we think we know best.